Good evening, everybody. Welcome to meeting number 206 of the Planning Committee. Council acknowledges the Wadawurrung traditional owners of this land. I pay my respect to all elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of the greater Geelong community today. This meeting is being broadcast on the internet, and the recording of the meeting will be published on Council's website. Given the circumstances, where we can't have members of the community here with us in the gallery, it's terrific that we're still able to share our meetings with you via live stream. I will now introduce the panel. We have Joanne Van Slagren, Manager, City Development. We have John Rush, Coordinator, Statutory Planning. Lewis Muston, Senior Statutory Planner. Steve Rusak, Senior Statutory Planner, and will be joining us online for the Fitzroy Street application. The councillors we have before us in the chamber, we have Councillor Murnane, Councillor Aitken, Councillor Mason, Councillor Grisbeck, Councillor Nelson, and Councillor Marahi, and I'm Councillor Sullivan. Due to COVID-19 and social distancing measures, this planning committee is via live stream. Objectors were able to lodge a submission prior to this meeting, close of business Monday, replacing the past personal presentations. Objectors' submissions were provided to this committee and the applicants on Tuesday morning. Applicants were then able to finalise their submissions to this committee by close of business Wednesday, replacing the physical presentation. The procedure for this hearing this evening will be: the officers will present a brief summary of the written report to the committee. The panel may then ask questions of the officers. I will then read out the list of objectors who have submitted objections, highlights of the objections as well. I will then read out highlights from the applicants' responses. The panel will then further discuss the application and make a decision. The decision of this committee is the final decision of Council under the delegated authority. If anyone is aggrieved by the decision of this committee, they may appeal to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal in Melbourne, or staff can assist with this process during office hours. Do we have any apologies to be noted this evening? None? I would like to move for a confirmation of minutes for the last meeting dated 23rd January 2020. Do I have a mover? Councillor Mason, thank you. Seconder?
I was here.
I'm happy to move.
Councillor Grisbeck,
Yep.
thank you.
As long as I was here, Chair.
Are there any declarations of interest? None to be noted? Thank you. The first we have before us this evening is a submission of 1A Grandview Parade, Barwon Heads. I will now ask the officer to speak to the submission.
Thank you, Councillor. This application relates to number 1A Grandview Parade in Barwon Heads. The site is a rectangular shaped lot on the corner of Bridge Road and Grandview Parade, and it has a total area of 386 square metres. The subject site is at somewhat of a transitionary point between the residential area, between the Barwon River and the commercial area along Hitchcock Avenue.
Could you please speak a little bit louder so committee members can hear you?
Sure. Yeah, as I was saying, the subject site is situated at a somewhat transitionary point between the residential area to the northeast, between the Barwon River and Hitchcock Avenue, which has got many commercial uses fronting that street as well. Generally, the surrounding residential area, it features a mix of building typologies. There's a number of single-storey and double-storey buildings with pitched roofs, and a mix of external materials, including brick, timber, and rendered finishes. It is also noted that some of these sites have recently been redeveloped with some more contemporary residential dwellings as well. southern side of the site fronts Bridge Road and is opposite a commercial strip, which includes the IGA and the Barwon Heads Hotel. And in addition to this, as previously noted, there's more commercial land uses situated nearby along Hitchcock Avenue, which is approximately 50 metres to the west of the site. The existing building on site is approximately 10.5 metres in height. It covers a relatively significant portion of the site as well, at approximately 248 square metres, or around 64% of the site. It's made up of 3 stories. At ground level, there is an existing shop which fronts Bridge Road, and there's also car parking serving that shop and a garage serving the dwelling above as well. The first and second floor levels contain one dwelling spread across the 2 floors. In relation to the planning history of the site, it's quite prudent to note that no planning permit was required to build the existing building. And when you actually look at the planning history of the site in relation to the construction of this building, it is identified that the existing building has been constructed lawfully and does not contravene the planning scheme. This application proposes internal alterations to the existing dwelling at first and second floor level. Those internal alterations would result in the construction of an additional dwelling on site. The works include construction of an internal party wall in the existing garage to separate it into 2 separate garages. Reconfigure the ground floor of the building to create secure storage areas for each proposed dwelling. Install new kitchen and kitchen preparation facilities in the proposed dwelling at first floor level, and install a new laundry and reconfigure the existing kitchen in the proposed dwelling at second floor level. So there's 2 permit triggers. The first one is under the general residential zone to construct a dwelling if there is at least 1 dwelling existing on the lot. And the second one is under the design and development overlay, where a permit is required to construct a building or construct or carry out works. It's also worth noting that given the existing building has been lawfully constructed, this application only seeks a planning permit for the construction of 1 additional dwelling on the lot, with no proposed external alterations to the existing building. The application is not exempt from the notice requirements, decision requirements, or the review rights within the Planning and Environment Act, and as such, notices were sent to owners and occupiers of adjoining land, including opposite, and an A3 sign was placed on the land for a 14-day period. A total of 17 objections were lodged with Council regarding the proposal. The matters raised in those objections included overdevelopment of the site, a lack of integration with the streetscape, and excessive bulk and building height, which would detrimentally impact the neighbourhood character of the area. Concerns regarding the possibility that the application is retrospective and the works to convert the existing dwelling to 2 dwellings has already been completed. Possibility that approving this application will set a precedence for future development. A lack of public notice when the building was constructed in 2017, and loss of on-street car parking, as well as not providing the required on-site car parking. In addition to the car parking issue, there were concerns raised about cars parked in the driveway over the pedestrian footpath. And whilst the concerns raised in those objections have been considered, it's not considered that those matters would warrant refusal of the application. The application has been assessed against the planning policy framework and the relevant local planning policies, including Clause 2263, the Increased Housing Diversity Areas Policy. And it's considered to demonstrate an acceptable response to the relevant state and local planning policies, including an appropriate balance between competing objectives where housing diversity is promoted while still seeking to retain important coastal character traits of the Barwon Heads area, and particularly so in an area which has been identified as an area for increased housing diversity. In regards to the merits of the proposed works to internally alter the building to construct a second dwelling, with no external alterations proposed, it is considered that the application responds appropriately to the relevant decision guidelines contained within the general residential zone, including the objectives and standards of Clause 55, the design requirements of the Design and Development Overlay, Schedule 42, and the on-site car parking requirements have been met, those contained within Clause 5206. It is therefore recommended that the responsible authority, having considered all matters which the Planning and Environment Act requires it to consider, decides to issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit for internal alterations to an existing dwelling and construction of a second dwelling at 1A Grandview Parade, Barwon Heads, in accordance with the plans submitted with the application and subject to conditions. Just on the conditions regarding condition 1A, it is recommended that the wording of this condition is revised to require screening of habitable room windows within the northern and western side elevation up to a minimum of 1.7 metres above finished floor level. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Now I will proceed to the list of objectors. I will reiterate to the people viewing at home, I thank everybody for their submissions. It is a shame that you cannot be here in person due to current circumstances, but please be assured all submissions have been read and noted by this committee. We have submissions from A.E. Villy, J.R. Brooks, C.T. Bridges, R. Hastings, the Barwon Heads Association Incorporated, T.J. Delahunty, J.A. Robinson, F.A. Walk, J.G. Nolan, S.A. Gatehouse, A. Lindsay, P.J. Donovan, G.M. Donovan, M.M. Bridges, C.M. Harris, C.M. Clifton Jones, C.J. Ryan, A.S. Quinton, P.G. Angelovich, P. Wade. Thank you for your submissions. I will now read highlights from submissions. I'm afraid we don't have time this evening to read all submissions and documents in entirety, but I will highlight. Arguments made are 2 food preparation areas and 2 bathrooms in the residence, 2 garages, and 3 separate utility connections clearly indicated. Fails to comply with important issues of site coverage, street setback, side setback, permeability, fencing, canopy trees. The association is an objector to the application and requests Planning Committee further adjourn consideration until enforcement issues are addressed by Council's building and planning departments, and that errors and inadequacies in the report are addressed with a revised report. There will be a loss of public on-street spaces. That Grandview Parade is undulating with poor sightlines, creating dangerous conditions for pedestrians. The applicant will generate additional revenue from vehicle demand and should be refused. Early in construction, it appeared the long-term plan was to construct as much as possible without needing a permit, and thus avoiding public scrutiny in the initial stages of development. A building surveyor has signed off on this building, and yet there appears to be no report to the Planning Committee on what was signed off or what works have been carried out. that some aspects of the development are non-compliant in relation to boundary setbacks, walls on the boundaries, permeability and drainage, landscaping and planting trees, site cover and footpath. And enforcement issues, which should be dealt with through the enforcement agencies of the building and planning departments again. There's a quick summarisation of some submissions. I apologise. Do anybody have questions of the officer so far? Councillor Aikens.
Yeah, I know you've mentioned it and the report mentions it as well too, but I just need to get an absolute clear understanding. The building, there's no proposed changes to the building because most of the works have actually already occurred. So, you know, like the separation of services have already occurred. Everything's occurred. So we're actually issuing a planning permit for the works that have actually predominantly already been completed. Is that right?
The plans submitted with the application show that the works are proposed. Regarding separation of services, I'm not entirely sure what the existing on-site circumstance is. It doesn't require a planning permit for those connections, but the planning permit, or the planning application rather, is is submitted on the basis that the works to construct a second dwelling are proposed, and those works are internal works.
Just through the chair again, and it may not be, it may be Joe that actually has to answer the question. We have been advised, and the information before us makes it quite clear, that we're not considering the works that have been undertaken legally up until this point. However, the planning application that's before us, if we accept it, will make those illegal works legal in terms of, because we'll be issuing a permit for them. What has our enforcement action been up until now, just so the councillors actually get an understanding of that as well too? What enforcement has council undertaken because works actually have been at this site that are in breach of the original planning permit?
I'll address that, Councillor Aiken. Thank you very much for the question. Look, in answer to your first question, you're absolutely right. What we're looking at approving first and foremost is an existing building with internal alterations. With respect of the enforcement aspect, Council has issued a statement of compliance on this site that was applied for by the applicant for the use of the shop back in 2016. That's considered a lawful use at this particular stage. After that, we've also had a two-lot subdivision issued for the site. So no third service meter has been permitted, but I will need to clarify that no planning permit is required for that service meter. So in terms of the question about enforcement, at this particular stage, we haven't been advised until this application was submitted that there were enforcement issues. It's very difficult to sometimes prove how many people are living in a dwelling and whether they're separate or not. We need to organise an inspection of that property if tonight the decision is not to support the application.
Thank you. I have a similar question. Perhaps we have touched on it already, but I just want to clarify further. The initial approval was for a shop and one dwelling, and from our point of view, that was the intent at the time. I understand that was the intent, was a shop and one dwelling. Is that right? Thank you. Well, I have a follow-up question, and it still is a matter of clarification, and that is, though the intent was for a shop and one dwelling, services at that time were already put in for for a shop and 2 dwellings. Is that correct?
We're not aware of that until the objections were submitted to us. From a council planning perspective, we don't go out and look at the meters. They need to apply to those authorities, so we haven't inspected the meters at this stage.
Thank you. So I understand it from your point of view, but I understand it also from an historical point of view that there appears to be a separate intent from the beginning.
On face value, from what the objectors say, that would be true.
Thank you.
Councillor Grisbeck.
Thank you. And a question also for the officers, because you guys are the only ones we can see right now. In relation to that, we obviously sent this report out for our normal referrals. What did our any other within the City of Greater Geelong, did we get any information back from our internal officers about that particular topic?
This particular application wasn't referred to any internal departments. As the works are only internal, it was just a matter of considering the implications of those internal works to construct a second dwelling, and that didn't require any internal referral to other council departments.
Councillor Murnane.
Can you just clarify for us the work that is purported to be done in terms of effectively creating a capacity for what's now prescribed? Is that against our regulations, or?
Appreciate the question, Councillor Murnane. Look, it's not unusual, nor is it illegal to install a second food preparation facility. It's also not uncommon for 2 bathrooms to be present, 1 on each side. I think the thing that draws most of our attention is the 3 service meters. So from our perspective, that's as much information as we're aware of, and that's what we assessed.
There are no further questions from councillors.
Sorry, can I just ask about the car parking? So if you're having 2 dwellings rather than 1, wouldn't there be an extra requirement for additional parking?
So in the car parking requirements in the planning scheme, a dwelling requires 1 car parking space if that dwelling only contains 2 bedrooms. If you have 3 or more bedrooms, you require 2 car parking spaces. So because these 2 proposed dwellings each have 2 bedrooms, they only require 1 car parking space each.
So the plans show the double garage to be cut in half. Is that am I on the right track? So that'll create the 2 parking spaces for the 2 dwellings.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Just as a final point of clarification from our view, there was a submission also received from the applicant, St Quintin's Consulting, that has been submitted as part of their opinion why the application should be supported too.
Councillor Mason.
I have an alternative motion.
I will firstly read out highlights from St Quintin's, the applicant, if I may first. In regards to 1A, Grandview Parade, Barwon Heads, and these will be highlights of as such. The works proposed to achieve this outcome are confined to internal alterations within the existing building. No external buildings or works are proposed. The existing building was constructed without need for a planning permit under the provisions of the then Residential Growth Zone Schedule 3. Similarly, the existing food and drink premises was a Section 1 permit not required, use at the time of its commencement. It appears that the substance of all objections relate to the previous construction of the building, the process involved in the construction, and its built form outcome. We therefore request that a determination be based upon the merits of the planning permission as sought by the current application. In regards to the recommended conditions before us, we request that both Condition 1A and 4 be deleted. Condition 1A is vague and open-ended, implying that all habitable room windows be screened. As no changes are made to any window openings, Condition 1A and 4 are unnecessary and should be deleted accordingly. Do any councillors wish to make further remarks or questions? Nelson.
I'll just ask the officers just a few questions about the objections, just with regard to what was just said. It said that the objections relate to the previous, or the existing, sorry, I can't see, the existing dwelling. And I'm reading through the objections, and they seem to relate to the existing dwelling, which didn't require a permit.
Correct. The existing dwelling was issued as a building permit, or if I could call it, the existing building was issued as a building permit. A building permit required under Class 6A for a shop and ancillary for the dwelling on top of it. So yes is the answer.
I won't go through them all, I'm just reading them myself.
Can
I just clarify, in the objections, I'm not sure if the officers can answer, there was supplied to us some accommodation links off a website that showed that the intention, or that they were already leasing them as 2 apartments. What do we say to that?
The burden of proof is for that to be demonstrated. I can see that that information has come through since we've received that tonight. I guess the applicant would say that you could have a family of 8 living there under one roof, as opposed to 2 families of 2 or 4 living there, because the alterations are in itself internal. So what we say to that, taking into account trying to give a balanced approach to both sides, is that that is disappointing, because from our end we've only received that notification recently. Having said that, we have no control over how a property is rented out, and we just have to take that on face value. As stated earlier, if the application were not to be supported, we would then investigate that and look to demonstrate whether that has been occurring.
Thank you. Nothing.
Any further remarks, questions from councillors before I call for a recommendation? Are there any recommendations from councillors?
I have an alternative recommendation.
Do we have a seconder? Do we require a seconder?
I'll make the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Grisbeck. Councillor Mason.
My recommendation, alternative recommendation, is that the responsible authority, having considered all matters which the Planning and Environment Act 1987 requires it to consider, decides to refuse to grant a planning permit for the internal alterations to an existing dwelling and construction of a second dwelling at 1A Grandview Parade, Bowen Heads, in accordance with the plan submitted with the application on the following grounds. 1. The proposal does not accord with the planning policy framework, particularly clause 15.01-2S, building design of the Greater Geelong Planning Scheme. The proposed development does not, A, minimise the detrimental impact of development on neighbouring properties and the public realm, B, ensure the form, scale and appearance of the development enhances the function and amenity of the public realm. 2. The proposal does not meet the local planning policy, particularly residential objectives at clause 21.14-2, the Bellarine Peninsula. The proposed development does not, A, enhance the rural and coastal environment on the Bellarine Peninsula, and B, does not seek to protect the character of Bowen Heads as a coastal village within a sensitive environment and significant landscape setting. And finally, point 3, the proposal is inconsistent with the decision guidelines of clause 65.01 of the Greater Geelong Planning Scheme, as it does not represent orderly planning of the area given the following, and that's point A, the development of the site and subsequent conversion to 2 dwellings goes against the spirit and intent of local planning policies for the Barwon Heads area.
Councillor Mason. Councillor Grisbeck.
Yeah, I support the alternative recommendation. I feel that there is, it's just not making sense to me. I think that there are, whilst the officer's report has said that it is not changing the outside of the building, it actually is fundamentally changing the inside of the building. It is making the opportunity that it provides to, when it creates 2 dwellings, is that you will get the thoroughfare and the extra people going to and from. And I just feel that the intention when it was originally built was not for that. And I'm listening to the objectors and I can understand why they are objecting. And at this point in time, I'm agreeing with the alternative recommendation put forward by Councillor Mason.
Do you have any other councillors to make remarks? Councillor Manade.
Look, I'm inclined to vote against this alternative recommendation. The building's there; it's not going to have any detrimental effect on any different effect on the surrounds. I mean, this is internal, and it's not going to have any different effect than it currently has. And if they haven't broken the law by any works that have been done internally, I'm not sure that their proposal to now convert it to 2 titles is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, my understanding of the Barwon Heads area is that it probably is better by having this inner city type of approach where you've got another family living close to the Hitchcock Avenue shopping centre, which will support that centre by walking to the centre and not driving to the centre, because it's a pretty crowded little centre as it is. So I'm not sure that they've done too much wrong here. So I would be more in favour of supporting this application.
Councillor Akins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's actually not an easy decision, this one, because I can actually see the officers have actually they're trying to resolve a problem by actually the recommendation that's been written. But I also sympathise. I have sympathy for the objectors and the broader community, because in fact we're actually rewarding behaviour, it appears, that has been contrary to what should be expected, and that is that a planning permit was issued. The planning permit had set criteria to be undertaken. The neighbours have sat there and watched what's actually happened at that site location, and there has been enforcement concerns that have been presented, and we haven't exercised completely those enforcement activities, and the officers have attempted, in terms of a realistic sense, trying to resolve the problem now by giving a retrospective planning approval for the site location. So I get that, but ultimately I have to live with what I'm comfortable with as a councillor, and I don't believe that I should be using my vote to reward behaviour, which I think would be upsetting for myself as well too, and that is that somebody has clearly taken advantage of the planning process to achieve an outcome that they wanted from the beginning in this particular activity, and so I'll be supporting the alternative recommendation that's been put forward by Councillor Mason. Yeah.
Councillor Nelson.
Mr. Chair, this is a very interesting one, because I mean the building's already there, so I'm not sure what happens if this gets knocked on the head. What does actually happen if this gets refused? This
The applicant will have the opportunity to appeal the decision to VCAT.
Just that it says that it doesn't blend in with the local landscape, and you look around and there's There's an old service station there that hasn't been used in 40 years, and that's really ugly. And across the road, there's a joint that's got so many extensions on it that's happened over the last 40 years. That looks pretty ordinary as well. And you look at the building that's currently there, the applicant, and that's a nice-looking building. So I'm not sure why the alternate recommendation. I understand that that's what we have to do, but so I'm leaning towards Councillor Murnane because they haven't broken the law, they haven't done anything wrong. But then to Councillor Aiken's point, do we then reward bad behaviour? Because they obviously knew what they were doing from the start, and that's the bit that sticks with me. And we're here to represent our community, so I'll make my decision in just a moment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Murray.
I think when we came in here, there's black and white decisions, but this is not one of them. There's certainly some grey areas in relation to perhaps the history of this development. So up front, I'm not going to support the alternative, but I understand why it's been put forward. To me, this complies with the general residential zone, which is to encourage development that respects the neighbourhood character. And Barwon Heads is certainly a unique coastal design character town, and they're pretty much hot to trot down there, the Barwon Heads residents, if in any development across it all. So I understand the objections and can see why people have objected to this, but you sort of I'll be voting against the alternative, but hesitant doing it. But I will vote against the alternative because I understand the angst in the community, as I said, being Barwon Heads, but it actually complies with the relevant authorities, the policies, the acts that we've got to comply with ourselves. So I'll be voting against the alternative.
Councillor Murray. I will put the alternative recommendation to the vote. All those in favour? Votes against? The recommendation passes. Thank you. We'll now be moving on to application 135 Fitzroy Street, Geelong, application number PP-623-2019. Thank you. I'll now hand over to officers for a summary of the written report to the committee. In your hands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Steve Rusak. For the benefit of those on the live stream, I'm a senior planner with the city. Planning permit number PP 623-2019 relates to the land at 135 Fitzroy Street in Geelong. The application proposes the partial demolition of the building that occupies the entire part of the building that occupies the entire site to make way for the construction of 40 dwellings, including 7 apartments and as well as a corresponding multi-lot subdivision. Unusual to pause at this early stage, but I just want to clarify something. There was documentation, including the public notification of this application, that made mention of the reduction of car parking or a requirement for a permit to reduce the car parking requirement. Subsequent to that, and with the detailed of assessment, we've determined that in fact this proposal already complies with the requirements of the scheme, and no reduction of car parking requirement approval is required, so that's no longer a part of this proposal. I'll take questions on that later, clearly, if they come up. The site occupies just under 3/4 of a hectare, or 7,493 square metres on the east side of Fitzroy Street. The site's bounded by Carr Street to the south, Forest Street to the east, and an unnamed public lane on the northern boundary of the site. It's currently developed with a fairly extensive, in fact, entire site is developed with a complex of buildings that are made of corrugated metal, previously used for furniture sales, and many in Geelong will know it formerly as the Big Shed Furniture Market. That use has ceased, and for all intents and purposes the building has remained vacant since. The site's within a general residential zone. It's an incremental residential area, incremental change area, I should say. All land opposite and along Fitzroy Street, Forest Street and the unnamed lane is all used and developed for dwelling. The land to the south over Carr Street is the Geelong Railway, of course, railway line, and south of that is the industrial area of South Geelong. The site is within the heritage overlay, and it's recognised as a place of local heritage significance, in particular for its architectural and historic significance as an unusual example of 1920s industrial architecture. The earliest part of the building is understood to have been a farm implement or factory. Windmills, I think, among other things, very early on in the 1910s or thereabouts. It was subsequently redeveloped to become, or to be used for a glass manufacturing works, and then subsequent to that, the Denny's Lascelles Limited developed the rest of the site and used it as a wool store. This application proposes the demolition of the later parts of the building, but the retention of the earliest part of the building. The building fabric to be retained is proposed to be converted to apartments, 7 apartments over 2 stories, in accordance with the plans. The balance of the site is proposed to be redeveloped with 33 double-storey townhouse-type developments, dwelling units, I should say. There's going to be a mix. On the plans it shows 2, 3 and 4 bedroom apartments. They have pitched roofs that take a design response and language from the existing building with the pitched roofs and wall forms, etc., and materials as well. The application was put to public notification with signs on the site and letters to all opposite land owners and occupiers. Council did receive 17 objections. Prominent among those, or primarily, they dealt with questions or concerns around the loss of heritage fabric and the proposed lack of detail around how much of that was to be lost, the scale and the density of the development, the impact on the existing character of the area, loss of privacy and overlooking, traffic safety, car parking concerns and traffic generation concerns, and a number of other issues that were being detailed in the officer report. A consultation meeting was held with objectors, but there's some minor changes made relating to overlooking and things, but nothing substantial in response to that. Nonetheless, no objections have been withdrawn. They all have been sustained. This is a substantial development, and it's undergone a detailed assessment against all of the relevant policies and requirements of the scheme and the Planning and Environment Act. It's been found that this is a proposal that will result in a change to the heritage place. However, it's been determined that that result is acceptable on the basis that it's going to allow us to achieve a fair, orderly, economic and sustainable development outcome for the site. The redevelopment proposes an increase in the availability and diversity of housing styles in the area, which is one of the purposes of the scheme. And it is determined that the new dwellings will be respectful of the heritage significance of the place. So on that basis and in accordance with the recommended conditions, it's respectfully recommended that the grant of a permit be given.
Very much. Do I have any questions from councillors to officers at this point? Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Councillor Sullivan. I'd just like to follow up a little bit, please, on the demolition plan. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that there were two heritage buildings. One was the glass factory, and there was another arced or frame on the far end on the north near Fitzroy Street, I think. What was the reason for not accepting the retention of that?
Just for clarification around the extent of the heritage control, first of all, to answer your question, which is that the heritage overlay does apply to the entire site, to the boundaries of the site, doesn't extend out to the street, and that of course covers all of the buildings on the land. So if I can just get to the specifics of your question, the building itself is a complex of buildings that have evolved over time from the very earliest to the most recent, and you'd have to refer to a report about when they were. Generally speaking, the advice that I've looked through here from our heritage consultant and others is that there are effectively three parts to that. There is the original part on the north boundary that's proposed to be retained and redeveloped to a large extent. Councillor Mason, I think you might be referring to the subsequent extension of that building that happened in, as I understand it, about the 1920s, which is an elliptical arched, I'll call it an extension. There's a pavilion, I think, is what the wording has been used in the report by our heritage advisor, which extends out to the eastern side to Forest Street. That is a subsequent extension, but then much later than that, as I understand it, was the balance of the site. At no point in time did this proposal seek to retain the elliptical arched pavilion. It's always proposed to demolish that as a part of the redevelopment and only retain the earliest part of the building. So the simplest answer to your question is we assessed the proposal as it was presented to us. We didn't return an alternative to the applicant for consideration.
So if I can continue, Councillor Sullivan. There was no, it's my understanding there was nevertheless an objection, or there was an analysis that there was some significance to this building?
Two parts to that question. The first part is, yes, there was an objection that raised concerns around the loss of that part of the building. It was a very detailed objection. The other part to that is that our independent heritage advice that council obtains at an officer level to make these recommendations did express a preference for the retention of that, but did not refuse or recommend the refusal of the grant of the permit on the basis that it's being lost. So in other words, it hasn't been provided with an elevated level of significance such that we should be refusing this, was the advice to us.
Thank you. And my last question then, have there been, I believe there have been some negotiations in regards to the internals, the fundamental fabric of the glass factory itself, where there's now to be buildings within it. Some of the fabric is to be removed. Some of the internal timber work, etc. Has this been explored to the full extent where some of this material can be retained?
This is a difficult question, and I'll explain why. The heritage overlay in this instance does not extend to the controls of internal building fabric. So there are technically, if you like, no specific controls that whereby we can require the retention of internal parts of the building. That said, of course, the internal parts of the building hold up the external parts of the building, if I can put it that way. So there is a direct correlation about what ought to stay and what ought not. The work that's been done around this in response to Council's requests for further information during, or I should say, in response to Council's discussions with the applicant through this process, has been to require that they provide a conservation works schedule, as the phrase used, which is essentially a document that identifies those parts of the building, both internal and external, that are to be retained. That has been provided and does form a part of the application. And a demolition plan as well. You'll see by the recommendations of conditions to form a part of a permit that Council would be comfortable with more detail around that, in fact would require it as a part of the permit to really document that to a greater extent than it has been in the application. So again, the answer to your question is yes, it was raised, more information was provided, and that work schedule does identify some of those internal parts to be retained.
Thank you.
Any other questions from councillors at this time? Murray.
Just in relation to, you made reference to the overlooking, so I guess, and I would imagine we're talking about the objectors there in Furnace Street that back onto the laneway between the big shed and the residences. Was there any changes made to the development in relation to the overlooking into those premises?
The application was amended earlier this year, February, if I remember correctly, and those changes did relate to the external parts of the building to be retained, the apartment building, the glassworks building, if I can call it that. That's where the overlooking primarily was of concern, as well as, I should add, the dwellings that had some overlooking to the north that would have been accessible off the unnamed lane. So the answer is yes, there were changes, but they didn't specifically relate to the overlooking. What I have done is done an assessment of the overlooking for the purposes of the residential development standards, Res Code standards, and determined that it generally complies with that, as well as consideration of the objection. We have put some conditions, I believe condition 1B of the permit would require that be formalised more on the plans. And in relation to parking, am I right in saying that there will be more parking there after this, after this development, if it is approved, than there is now? You are correct in saying that. The question of parking, and again for the benefit of anybody who was watching on the live stream, I'd like to just briefly explain that. The building in its current form has previous planning permission for use as a commercial premises, essentially a furniture retailer. Council issued that permit a number of decades ago. That permit did allow for that use to occur and provide some car parking within the building. So notwithstanding the building occupies the entire site, my assessment of that original planning permit showed that there were 19 car parking spaces shown or provided within the building. However, the statutory requirement for that use was well in excess of 100 car parks. So in other words, there was already a significant reduction by way of the existing use. What we have today is a proposal that also has a car parking requirement, but instead of the 19 that it currently offers, it is proposing, I believe it's 73 car parks, which is a significant increase to the 19, obviously, that is there at the moment.
Just to continue on the parking in Forest Street, will there be parking on both sides of the road there?
Go to the plan there for you before I answer, if I may.
I ask that question because we have had some communications that if that's the case, is the road wide enough for emergency vehicles to be able to move through there?
Two parts to my answer to that question. So the plans show that the width of Forest Street, sorry, wasn't it, Councillor? That Forest Street isn't shown to be to change. What will change there, obviously, is the configuration of vehicle crossings that will potentially impact on the configuration again of on-street car parking compared to what's there. Comparing what's there to what will be. In terms of the width, there isn't a requirement here that this developer widen that street or anything along those lines. It is the responsible of council, of course, to maintain and provide streets that accord with relevant road construction and engineering standards. We haven't recommended I haven't recommended in these conditions that any changes or widening of that street occur, and I'm not aware, given the advice of council's engineers who have also made referral comments to this application, they've not raised concerns about the width of that for the purposes of access by emergency services. So I can't say that that's a specific impediment to this development proceeding.
In addition to that, Councillor Murray, I draw attention to the Heggie property submission that's been provided in addition to tonight's meeting, and they have made mention that the on-site car parking for all dwellings is in accordance with the Australian standards, or on-street parking.
Any further questions of officers from councillors at this time? I'll proceed to read out the list of objectors. We have received objections from... Sorry, Councillor Nelson.
Yeah, just going back to the overshadowing or the objections about overshadowing, and that main building remains. That main building is directly, well, it appears to be directly where those objectors are. So is that right? The main building that remains, the glasshouse building.
Clarity, are you speaking to overshadowing or overlooking?
Well, probably both.
On the south side of the unnamed lane, so any shadow would be cast to the south.
Yeah, it just seems a bit strange that they're complaining about overshadowing.
I'll ask you to clarify what your question is. Sorry,
I can
Councillor.
understand that. I can take that on. You're saying the height of the building at the moment is roughly over 5 metres anyway, and the height of the new structure isn't too different. Is that what you're saying,
Yeah,
Councillor? And so the overshadowing is inconsequential on the basis that the heights are matching.
Then the overlooking, there's the building, and then there's a laneway, and then all those houses there face to Fitzroy Street, so they're all garages, so you'd be overlooking a garage anyway.
Walk along that laneway, you'll see significant garages along there on the backs of that laneway, absolutely.
An objection about heritage, loss of heritage buildings. Is the glasshouse the only heritage building there? Is that correct?
Refer back to my previous answer around that. The heritage overlay extends to the entire site. So they're all protected, if you like, under the heritage overlay. Sorry, not protected is the wrong word. They're all affected by the heritage overlay. Your question relates to, because it's a complex of buildings, that some are older, some have different original uses, and some have different architectural merit, if you like. The original glass building, it has its own character and significance. The elliptical extension brings some architectural significance to that, and the rest of the building brings its own as well. They're slightly different. They're not all the same.
They're not heritage listed.
They are all heritage listed. The entire site is heritage listed. Sorry, it's within the... sorry, clarification.
Yeah, this is where
it's in the heritage overlay.
I guess if I could draw attention to page 129 of the report. Page 129 is Council's independent heritage consultant's view in determining the significance of the existing site and looking at the different structures. Points that are provided there.
Sure, we're on the same
right.
page.
Yeah, 129 doesn't talk about that.
Thing that you've got.
Advisor's report, and it's on, pardon me,
About car parking, I think.
Might be 128.
Mine might say page 104.
Because we might have different versions of the same
The same as
report.
Councillor Mason.
So it's 129 off the agenda that was put onto the council's website. So it would, Mr Rush is referring to page 128 of the agenda on the council's website.
Heritage Department response starts on page 96 of our pack, and I'm not sure where in that response.
Page 104.
Sorry?
104.
104. Okay.
104.
apologies there.
This is the response by the Heritage Advisor to Council.
I want to be voting on removing heritage buildings if Heritage Advisor thinks it's a bad idea. All right, that answers my question. Thanks for that.
Where is Councillor Grisbeck?
If I may just ask and go back to a question, something that you raised before about the laneway. So there's the laneway, I'm not so that laneway will remain, and the access to the properties at the back there will remain for those properties there on Verner Street.
The laneway is a council laneway, so yes, absolutely it will remain. Indeed, the plan of subdivision shows that there is a proposal to widen that laneway from the current 3 metres to wider. I don't have the number off the top of my head, 4.2 I'm told, and that allows for access into the car parking that's proposed in the rear garages, and actually may well improve access.
No further questions of officers at this time. I'll proceed to the list of objectors. We have objections from J.D. Attenborough, J.L. Patterson, D.W. Carrington, T.J. Reid, P. Divakaran, K.V. Russell, B.J. Brow, S.R. Brown, L. Smith, C.M. Tonkin, K.A. Rust, from the National Trust of Australia, Geelong Branch, J.A. Volcolt, A.J.R. Jackies, C.P. Carey, J.M. Stein, R.P. Willets, B.D. Moray. I now proceed to read highlights of objections. From the National Trust, we have an extension to their original submission, that the decision should be postponed until the recommendations of the South Geelong Railway Station Urban Design Framework Plan are proceeded, that this high-density development is inconsistent in the area comprised predominantly of traditional single-storey detached homes. The amendment plans dated 24th of February 2020 do not address the 10 objections summarised in the Geelong and Region Branch National Trust submission of the 23rd September 2019. That a heritage overlay protection near the subject site exists. That 2 significant industrial heritage buildings are on the subject site. That by using the footprint of former United Glassworks Ltd building to become apartments is not restoration, as it does not conserve the fabric nor leave any remnant of the original purpose. Accumulation of rubbish and a number of placement of rubbish bins will exist. that there will be a waiver of car parking requirement, although that no longer applies. Does it, Steve?
Correct, it doesn't. It's not a matter that council can consider because it complies with the requirements of the scheme.
Strike that. There are concerns about emergency vehicle access. Moving on to individual complaints now. There will be insufficient street parking is a concern that the developer considers on-site garaging satisfactory. There is opposition to that. The ends of the highlights. I will now proceed to read highlights of the response from Hague Property in response to submissions. State that on-site car parking for all proposed dwellings will be delivered in accordance with Australian standards. That introduction of extended driveway to provide rear access to most new dwellings fronting Forest Street will exist. Significant streetscape improvements, including street tree planting to Forest, Fitzroy and Carr Streets, that there will be improvement to pedestrian access to South Geelong Station and formed parking bays on Carr Street with curb outstands, line marking and signs. In regards to the Trust's submissions, that the proposal is well positioned to make a significant contribution to Geelong's economic recovery and will result in significant local expenditure and employment at this time of great need. That the application has a long history with initial discussions commenced in 2018, a submission of draft plans prior to formal lodgement in June 2019, and that plans have been formally amended twice. In regards to heritage, the idea that the proposal should be assessed against controls that apply to the adjacent areas or some future form of controls is not supported. This should be regarding the South Geelong UDF. However, Hague Property remains committed to thorough restoration and repurposing of the two-storey element of the former Geelong Glass Bottleworks. That they have offered to work directly with the Geelong and Region Branch National Trust, and this offer remains open. Further, the submitter has noted that the need for a comprehensive study into the legacy of the life of Gordon Anderson and Hague Property is prepared to actively support such works. In regards to rubbish and car parking, in response to the earlier concerns expressed by other submitters, plans were amended to specifically show space for 3 bins at all homes and screen bin compounds. That no waiver of car parking requirements is needed, as all homes are provided with such on-site parking in compliance with scheme requirements. And in summary, we've undertaken the works towards compliance with the City of Geelong's environmentally sustainable development policy, including a commitment to all homes meeting a minimum 7 NATO's rating. I have any further comments or questions from councillors?
Can I just clarify then with the officers that this is a development which will require council to collect normal rubbish, like as in a residential street? This is not going to be waste held on site and a private waste collection, is that right?
It's common for quite a large development like this to require that a waste management plan be prepared as a part of the application. That was done in this instance. That waste management plan nominated a combination of both private waste collection, particularly for those dwellings that had, if you like, more of an internal location. They didn't have frontage to streets. And obviously street collection like normal dwellings would in this part of Geelong. So there's a combination. Our waste services unit have reviewed that waste management plan and come back and made some, generally support it, but have recommended some conditions and changes to that, and those recommendations form part of the conditions that are in the recommended permit.
If I may, Chair, just one more around the traffic. So obviously this will increase traffic other than what it was previously in terms of furniture retail. So how have we taken that into account? Is there any requirements on fixing roads or making intersections, roundabouts? Are we doing any of that in this application?
The application included a detailed traffic management plan that considered traffic generation and increases to the local traffic network. It concluded that the existing network can easily accommodate the increase. Our traffic engineers, of course, have reviewed those and not raised any concerns. And certainly there aren't any recommendations that this developer alter or upgrade council infrastructure beyond, I should preface this, the lane to the north, which would be formalised as a part of this to provide access to the car parking along that's proposed along that northern lane.
Their requirements is to make good the footpath all the way around. That's what they talked about, increased pedestrian access.
Correct,
all the way around.
That's right. And upgrade infrastructure that's immediately adjoining the site, like the footpaths. And then if you know the site, which of course you do, some parts of the site don't have footpaths, so the proposal is that they be installed.
Mason?
Thank you, Councillor Sullivan. Devil in the details, I suppose, but given that we've just heard from the developer that the developer is prepared to work direct with the National Trust on the legacy issues and maybe some other heritage matters related to those buildings in the northeast, and given that you advised me before that the conditions, there is the possibility that there's for ongoing work to develop the specific conditions on the fabric and the nature of the glassworks building. If this is approved, then what are the real possibilities of future development of these conditions with the National Trust?
Again, two parts to that, if I can answer it this way. The recommended conditions relate to the provision of more detailed demolition plans, elevations, and other relevant detail, if you like. There's also a requirement for something called a demolition method statement, which is primarily aimed at ensuring that any of the fabric to be retained is safeguarded during, before, during and after the construction and redevelopment of the site. So these are common types of conditions that we see in permits that allow for partial demolitions and redevelopments. In terms of the offer by the National Trust and any engagement that the applicant or future developer may have, it would be unusual to place any of those sorts of requirements in a permit like this because it really is a voluntary agreement and negotiation between those parties. The National Trust, and we very much value here at Council the input of the National Trust into decisions like this, particularly in the form of their objections. They have a long history of providing a lot of detail and putting in a lot of work in things like this. But that said, Council uses its own independent heritage advice, expert advice, and we use all of that to form our recommendations and decisions. The role of the National Trust beyond tonight's decision, whatever it may be, is a matter for the National Trust to choose to engage with or not, with the applicant or not. I'll point out as well that this is not a site that is it's of heritage significance under the heritage overlay, but it's not heritage listed as such. It's not heritage listed with Heritage Victoria, which I don't want anybody to confuse those different roles and parties. And the National Trust may or may not choose to engage with that. It sounds to me like the applicant's made an offer, and that's a matter for the National Trust and the applicant to resolve for themselves in the officer's view here.
Have any further comments from councillors at this time before I call for a recommendation? Do we have any councillors with a recommendation before us this evening? Murray.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to move the recommendation that's before us, that being the responsible authority, having considered all matters which the Planning and Environment Act 1987 requires it to consider, decide to issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit for the partial demolition, construction of 40 dwellings, including the 7 apartments, and a multi-lot subdivision of 135 Fitzroy Street, Geelong, generally in accordance with the plan submitted with the application and subject to the conditions.
Do I have a seconder? Councillor Manane. Do you wish to speak to the motion further?
I will. Thank you, Chair. Having lived in Geelong for quite a long time, the big shed has really been part of Geelong's fabric, and especially South Geelong. Been in there many times a few years ago, and it was a big shed and used for the sale of the second-hand furniture type furniture. But then we read in the press some time ago that it was sold, and years down the track now it's come before us with this application. I think this is a really good development. Effectively, what is there now is a big shed, and it's going to be replaced with the 40 dwellings, and the diversity of the dwellings, I think, are unique, and they'll be good for South Geelong. It provides, for couples and families to live there. It's close to the South Geelong railway station. Whilst presently no one has access to the site, it will be open. It'll have public access through. There's an open space. There'll be greenery there. So I think it's an exciting opportunity for South Geelong, and then with other developments close by, I think the South Geelong itself will welcome this. I understand the objections. I'm comfortable now with, and I had concerns with the overlooking from over the laneway into the rear residences of Verner Street, but I'm comfortable with that now, having heard it tonight. And I think an interesting part of, and I guess the history of this site is, I think I saw something, it may be 110 or 120 years ago, this site was actually advertised as housing blocks for sale. It was then purchased, and I can only imagine that it was rezoned, and then the bottle works and what it was originally used for, and the big shed, of course, in later years. And here we are, all this time later, seeking that it be, I guess, put back to what it's originally was advertised for people to live on that site. So I'm recommending the recommendation to the rest, Mr. Chair.
Murray. Councillor Manane.
Thank you. Like Peter and probably everybody here, we've all visited the big shed many times. And John, what was John's other name? I had it. John somebody. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Works.
Sorry?
The bottle works.
Yeah, okay. John Bottleworks, yeah. Look, it is good that the heritage aspect of this has been considered and retained. I mean, I know it's a complex of buildings, but there is some historical reference there, and the retention of part of it is recognised in the history of the site, and that's a really good aspect of what's been proposed. But the reality is the rest of these sheds are coming close to the end of their life, and certainly over the next few decades that will be the case. And in that instance, I don't see the balance of the sheds actually providing a lot of added value to the amenity of the area. And to have a lot of it's unusual to get an industrial development like this stuck right in the middle of some heavy residential. So I think in many ways, as Councillor Murray said, there'll be some welcome from residents, local residents, to have other high quality residential in the area, and it obviously complies with the residential zoning, and the car parking issues being addressed. I think also, as we seek to increase the number of residents we have in our push for greater numbers of residential inner city living, we don't necessarily want all of our residential inner city living pushed down into the city. You know, it'd be good to have it spread across some of these other areas, like South Geelong, and especially with the railway station there, it's going to provide additional services. So it's got a lot going for it. I think it's a good development. It certainly looks very appealing. It's got good variety of offering, so I'm more than happy to support it.
Councillor Manane, any councillors? Councillor Aiken.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Look, I have great respect for the National Trust and their membership, and in particular Jennifer Banto, who wrote and read the application and objection to this particular proposal. But then I also did read our Heritage Advisors report as well too, in David Rowe, and some important points that came from it was fantastic to learn the history of the site location that was being, and the value of those industrial sheds from the National Trust application, and also the information presented before us. But what our own Heritage Advisor made quite clear to us was that the challenge with the site is that it would appear that the existing fabric cannot be reasonably physically and economically retained and adapted to maintain its significance, given its previous usage and its constructions. So in other words, we actually have a building that we can't do anything reasonably with. And so what are the alternative solutions to do with that building? Well, we've actually got a quality proposal that's been presented to us tonight. It is, I believe, a clever interpretation of the heritage values that exist at that site location. And it certainly is a unique location in Geelong in that it is so close to our central activities area. It is clearly an architecturally designed site location which is coming up with some unique community aspects associated with it as well too, and it will be a desirable location to actually live because it's just near the South Geelong railway station as well too. So I think the proposal that's been presented before us does deserve support, and I support the recommendation that's been put forward by Councillor Murray.
Councillor Aiken. Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I don't want to go over what other councillors have said. I'll try not to, but I certainly agree with everything they've said. I was concerned, like Councillor Mason was, and I'm sure other councillors, but with the heritage or loss of heritage value of this site. But what's on offer here, I think, is exactly what I think the intent of the South Geelong transition precinct is for. This development, it looks good. It keeps that main the glass house building there, which I think is part of Geelong's clever and creative. I think that it meets both of those. I think it's respectful of heritage. I think this proposal adds to the amenity of the nearby area, because at the moment, as Councillor Manane said, it's just a building that's going to fall apart within a few years. That's for sure. So I think this is a great use of the site, and I'm sure the people that have rejected, certainly the ones in Verner Street, will certainly be really happy with what they see in the next few years.
Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Councillor Sullivan. I've heard what everybody said, and I fully endorse most of what has been said, and I think it is a logical step forward. What's happening, and it is very creative, and it has respected the heritage in very many ways. And if you look at the silhouette of the old shed, and I had some happy memories from that old shed too, but if you look at the silhouette of that and the silhouette of the new buildings, the new development, they are quite similar. But I do express some disappointment that somehow or other we could have put a bit more energy into the retention of that one building, or perhaps the two. Whether there could have been some other creative treatment, that little bit of extra work, just to do that touch more to the glass factory. And so, other than that, I think it's very exciting. It meets the need of increased diversity and density, and the railway station, all the things that we need in our modern city. But there were some suggestions about other treatments for that building, that glass, that could have been just a touch more. Thinking about how it might have been used for outdoor space, outdoor activities, perhaps some symbolic respect for the internal fabric could be found. So yes, it's a great innovation, but just that last little touch, I hope that we can put some more energy into that, and I hope that there's goodwill that the interested stakeholders can come, and perhaps we can come up with something, some improvements there.
Councillor Mason. Councillor Grisbeck.
Chair, I'm really pleased with the sensitive nature that the developer has designed this proposed application. I'm comfortable with the fact that these double-storey townhouses and apartments have been designed with the neighbourhood character in mind. It'll blend in with the surrounds, I really feel. They also pay respects to the history of the site with the proposal put before us, and I think they've really taken the time and effort to make sure that they're really looking at the history of the site. I feel that the possibility of residential activity would definitely improve the livability around that area instead of the commercial nature by which it currently sits. I also spent many a time at the big shed. My grandparents lived in Forest Street for a short period of time, so I do remember going in and out of there. Look, I assume that this will be given high demand, given the proximity to the train station. We could have got a lot worse an application before us, I feel. We could have got 3 stories, we could have got a lot of different things, but I think we've hit the right balance here, and I do hear the objectors and I hear what they're saying. Having taken everything into account, I do support the motion put forward by Councillor Murray.
Thank you very much, Councillor Grisbeck. With that all said, I put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? All those against? The motion passes. Thank you, everybody.